Here we are. We are live.
Sounds good.
All right. Hello, POL347. This is Raheem. I hope you're all doing well. I'm here with a very special guest, Mr. Erran Persley, currently a foreign direct investment and trade consultant with the Euphrates International Investment Company, and recently, for the bulk of the year 2019, was the Commissioner for Business Development with the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development. So Erran is going to be with us today to talk a little bit about how continental trade with Canada and Mexico affects Kentucky's state economy, and what to look out for on the horizon through the transition of NAFTA to USMCA and some of the potential implications for USMCA for Kentucky's economy. Erran, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Just want to let you know, you dropped off for a second while you're recording on my side, so I hope there's no delay as we're talking today.
There was a slight delay when I was transitioning over to you, but this will be very much a work in progress. We're going to both be learning by doing. So Erran, let me ask you a little bit about yourself and your own personal history, and in particular, how you got into the world of trade policy.
Well, it's an interesting and funny story how I got into trade policy. Actually, I was an undergrad student at Howard University studying political science. I saw an advertisement for an internship at the U.S. Department of Commerce. I had no idea really what that internship was about, but I applied to the job and I got called in for an interview. Now, here's the funny part of that story. When I went in for that interview with Mr. Leo Engelson, I sat down and the first thing he said to me was, "Young man, you have the lowest GPA of anyone who applied for this position." So at that point, I figured I'm not going to get this internship. And what I responded to Leo was, our response to Leo was this: "Mr. Engelson, I come from Kentucky. And in Kentucky, we like three things: bourbon, women, and horses. And none of those things are conducive to getting good grades."
And he had a connection to Louisville, I believe.
He began to laugh. He had a good friend who lived in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we talked about horses for about 45 minutes. And at the end of that internship, he actually offered me, at the end of the interview, he offered me the internship. And so that's how I began my career in international trade. And oddly enough, the very first project I worked on was a briefing book for President George H. Bush, who was going to do a trade mission to Mexico to start the beginnings of what was going to be the North American Free Trade Agreement drafting and negotiations.
Yeah, so you're still a very young man, but you have 3 decades under your belt of work on trade policy, starting as an intern.
Yes. So yes, I started off with the U.S. Department of Commerce as the intern. My first job out of college was working for the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service Office, doing export and trade counseling in Atlanta, Georgia, and then years working overseas and back in Washington, D.C., and then fortunately back home to Kentucky 30 years later to be Commissioner for Business Development to attract companies, foreign companies, to invest into Kentucky.
So that's a really good segue into my next question. Kentucky has a very particular set of geographical characteristics and characteristics in its labor market that make it a very attractive place for both foreign enterprises and internationally oriented businesses. You want to get into some of Kentucky's peculiarity in those domains and why it's such an attractive destination for a lot of those companies.
Yeah, a lot of what makes Kentucky very attractive, especially to foreign investors and companies in general, is really just our location. We are located with navigable waters around us. We have the UPS headquarters in operation in Louisville, Kentucky, DHL Worldport headquarters in Northern Kentucky by the CBG airport.
You're presently in Northern Kentucky yourself right now in Covington, right?
Yes, in fact, I am actually talking to you from Covington right now. I'm literally less than a block from the Ohio River as we're speaking. And then, of course, the new addition of the Amazon Prime hub that will be coming on board soon. And so when you're talking about getting things in and around the country or in and around the world, Kentucky is just a prime spot to have a manufacturing business where you can ship your products, your goods around the world very easily. Then also, that's just air transportation. When you talk about ground transportation, From Kentucky, within a few hours drive, you can reach 2/3 of the United States from Kentucky in an hour drive, 2-hour drive. And so that makes it, once again, a great spot to kind of be a central hub for getting your products in and around the US and also in and around the world as well. You just can't beat us geographically. And then when you talk about the fact that we have a very business-friendly climate here, we have low rates on our power usage here as well. And that becomes a very important factor for attracting companies as well, because the big power users need those low rates to be efficient and cost effective.
So a lot of upside. If you're anyone who works in anything like shipping or logistics, Kentucky is as attractive of a destination as you can get.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget, we have ports here like the Paducah McCracken port. It's a free trade zone. So actually you can ship your goods into that port and under certain circumstances, ship it back out, paying no tariffs.
So you have put in the time and effort to put together some data and statistics on the bottom line in terms of how trade with Canada and Mexico affects a number of Kentucky's manufacturing-oriented industries. You want to take time with me to go over some of those data?
I'd love to.
All right. So let's start with sort of the bottom line here, the stakes of tariff-free trade within the North American continent.
Right. So I think a big point to this slide is that, you know, it's good to see what would happen if we didn't have the North American Free Trade Agreement or the USMCA. So companies would end up paying, Kentucky companies, by the way, just Kentucky companies would end up paying between $297 million and almost $1 billion in taxes if we didn't have this free trade agreement in place. And all those who know business know this, that the more you have to pay in things like taxes, the higher the price of your goods and the higher the price of those goods to consumers. So being able to have this kind of free trade agreement at least lowers the cost of production for our US companies, and at the end of the day, benefits consumers as well.
So everybody loses if we don't have this agreement in place, sort of
exactly.
from the manufacturers, the employers, the workers, and ultimately the consumers.
Exactly. Let's go to our next slide, because that slide delves more into the actual size of our manufacturing network here in Kentucky. So as you can see from the slide, over the past 4 years, there have been 30,000 new jobs created in the manufacturing arena in Kentucky. More than $17 billion in investments announced and 900 new projects. The manufacturing sector in Kentucky over the past 4 years has been growing and booming as a major part of our economy. So any free trade agreement that can support the manufacturing sector in our country is going to be helpful to us in Kentucky.
There's a major, I guess, a major facet of the manufacturing sector is quite export oriented. So anything that would make the process of importing and exporting easier is going to be a net benefit for manufacturing here in Kentucky.
Exactly, exactly. And the next slide gets you more into kind of how the scope of what it looks like manufacturing in Kentucky. So you're talking about 40,500 manufacturing-related facilities in Kentucky that employ 260,000 people. So at the end of this, 13% of our activity, our workforce, is engaged in manufacturing. Now, understand this, that's 13% in Kentucky. The average across the US is 8.5% of the workforce that's engaged in manufacturing.
And it's on an upward trajectory in Kentucky.
Say it again, please.
It's been on an upward trajectory in Kentucky.
Exactly, exactly. And as you can see, that ends up being 31.8 billion of Kentucky-made products and services exported in the last year.
And these are very good jobs. I believe we'll be getting.
These are very good jobs. And we'll get into that later too. It's not only good jobs, but exporting jobs in general pay more than other jobs.
Yeah, and it's a good size premium.
Yes.
In the tens of thousands of dollars.
Yes. And I'll give you exact figures in a later.
So you're cutting out on me a little bit. Erran, can you hear me? You're cutting out on me just a bit. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Okay, I'm not seeing it on your screen here, but so the sectors that we have are, of course, automotive, food and beverage, aerospace, primary metals, chemicals, plastic rubbers, and healthcare. And what we're going to do is we're going to delve into how these sectors have their trade between the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and some of these sectors more directly. What's the impact, or what's the size of trade in some of those areas? And so on our next slide, you'll see a breakdown really of, okay, how much of our exports go to Canada and Mexico under these different sectors. And you can see the numbers of exports to these areas is quite large.
So the really big player here is transportation equipment, and that includes both automotive and aerospace?
Yes, exactly. And then our chemicals, machinery, and parts.
So it's a hell of a lot more than just bourbon and horses.
It's a hell of a lot more than just bourbon and horses. In fact, that's funny you say that, because as we're promoting Kentucky around the world, what we find out is when you say, what do you know about Kentucky? It usually is Kentucky Fried Chicken, bourbon, horses, and Muhammad Ali. So it's nice to really see in true numbers how much Kentucky has to offer to the globe.
I mean, those are not bad things to be associated with. I think all of those, except for Kentucky Fried Chicken, I would take in a heartbeat. I think those are all things to be associated with. That's a fine brand for the Commonwealth to have.
It's not a bad brand at all to have. You're right. You're exactly right.
But sorry for interrupting you. Did you want to get a little bit more into any of these categories?
Well, let's just break down and go to our next slide and talk, just so we can talk about the exports between Canada and Mexico and how it looks to the rest of the world when it comes to manufacturing in Kentucky.
So about a third of the export business we do globally is with Canada and Mexico.
Exactly. And that's important to note. You know, people are always looking for new markets to go into. It's good to know that when you're in Kentucky, some of your prime markets are just up to your north and down to your southern borders of the country. And so, yes, a big impact from Canada and Mexico come to our export markets, or come from our export markets. Now let's do a snapshot of what the MCA means to Kentucky. So as you can see from this slide, there are 931 firms in Kentucky that are exporting to Canada and Mexico. What I want to highlight is the fact that 63% of those firms are considered small and medium-sized businesses.
So what would be the employee cap on that, if you don't mind me interrupting?
What's again? Sorry, sir?
The employee cap, sort of at what number of employees would an enterprise no longer be an SME?
Over 500 employees.
Okay.
Yes. So anywhere from 0 to 500 employees, you're a small, medium-sized company.
But a good-sized company.
Pretty good-sized company, yeah. Some of the pretty good-sized companies, yes. And then, of course, we talk about jobs. 18,700 jobs depend on manufacturing exports to Canada and Mexico in Kentucky. And this goes to something we talked about earlier as well, wages. So as you can see, you know, manufacturing workers make on average $69,084 in total in compensation, in contrast to those who are not engaged in manufacturing, who make $41,933 annually.
To my students, this is one of the really big takeaways to take out of this presentation. We're talking about an almost $30,000 wage premium for working in manufacturing.
Right.
So not only have jobs been produced under NAFTA, but very, very good ones.
Right.
Ones that are compensated in a very competitive way.
Yeah, and that's a good point that you make, right? It's that the fact that you're not just creating jobs, you're creating good, high-paying jobs for your citizens, and that's important.
Because a lot of the rhetoric surrounding NAFTA was about a wage, kind of a race to the bottom. This notion that American workers would somehow be competing with Mexican workers for wages that are closer to what they are in Mexico. So we've seen almost the exact opposite borne out in Kentucky with the types of industries that have really thrived under NAFTA. So that here, I think, is one of the really big takeaways. It was one of the really big takeaways I got from Erran's presentation the first time I heard it. One of the really big takeaways that I'm hoping y'all are going to get.
Exactly. That's a good point. And I just want to say, one of the issues, because you mentioned Mexico, I think ultimately Mexico will be a big winner in the new USMCA agreement, because it does change the labor laws and labor agreements that we have between our countries. It takes Mexico up to a different level of wages and how they treat their workers as well. So ultimately, I think this is a win-win for all three countries. But I think overall, the working environment, Mexico will see the biggest development and increase. And that'll be good.
Massive levels of bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, which to me was astounding, given the general climate in Washington at that point. This was right on the heels of the impeachment vote.
Exactly.
For any kind of piece of legislation to get, I think all but 41 members of the House and all but 10 senators voted in favor of USMCA. For anything to get that level of bipartisan support in this climate really speaks to the kind of benefits all around that can be expected.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. The strength of this agreement is shown by the support it got when it was being voted on by the House and the Senate. I think
literally the week after impeachment, the House voted on it.
Right.
I mean, you couldn't think of a more polarized time in Washington, and for anything to get this level of bipartisan support is quite impressive.
And I'm not going to lie, I was quite surprised how smoothly it went after impeachment to get this USMCA agreement.
You know what it was? I think they heard that you were going to give the presentation at Center on the Friday, so they did it on the Thursday. It was literally a day before Erran gave his presentation on Center. So I'm gonna credit you and I for that.
You know what? We'll take that. I think it's
taking place at Center. They wanted your presentation material to be as topical as possible. That's the working hypothesis I'm going with.
And you know what? I support that 100%.
More than anybody helped usher it through. Like, we're gonna help this kid in Kentucky. We're gonna help this dude in Kentucky. That's my hypothesis. So anything else here you want to expand upon before we move to our next slide?
No, let's move on. And this gets more deeply into the actual numbers when we talk about trade between Kentucky, Canada, and Mexico. And as you can see, we're talking about Kentucky doing 31 billion exports to the world, and 9.9 billion of that being between Canada and Mexico. These are 2018 numbers.
It's almost exactly a third.
I'm sorry, excuse me?
Almost exactly a third.
Yes, almost exactly a third, as we saw before in our earlier graph. And then we talk about manufacturing firms, 3,000 plus firms in Kentucky. 931 of those 3,000 firms are doing trade with Canada and Mexico. It's incredible. And then, of course, we talked earlier about the salary ranges between the manufacturers, manufacturing jobs and non-manufacturing jobs.
Yeah. This is still astounding to me, the bottom right quadrant here. Just, not only the number of jobs, but how well each job is compensated, and the premium vis-a-vis other jobs in the economy.
Exactly. And now at this point, let's dive a little bit more into kind of what USMCA's key provisions are in the next slide. So of course, we have the rules of origin. This really helps our auto and truck manufacturers a great deal. Under the new rules, under USMCA, over 75% of the components have to be made within the trade region between Canada, the US, and Mexico in order to not have high tariffs put on them.
So is this specific to the auto sector?
It's not specific to the auto sector. It covers other things as well, but that's one of the specific areas that are impacted by the rules of origin.
So manufacturing supply chains in particular.
Yes. And then, of course, market access. We talk about this in terms of there are what you call trade barriers, and there's these non-tariff trade barriers. These are the ones that don't deal with tariffs per se, but deal with rules and regulations that can sometimes slow down market access.
Kind
And
of
the
health and
US,
safety.
yes, go ahead.
Sort of things like health and safety regulations. I guess kind of red tape.
Yes, all those things that can have an impact on your ability to trade or enter a market that are not tariff related.
Mm.
And then here's something you and I talked about last time, agriculture. What I called the unfair Canada dairy regulations. You may have some issue with it being, we call it unfair, but there were new laws, rules put in place to address some of the things that were seen as inconsistencies between how we do our work or our trade in agriculture that did impact dairy and also meat, poultry, even turkey exports between the
Canada's dairy sector in particular is still quite protected, but some of those protections were chipped away at through USMCA. Canada did give up a little bit in terms of access to American farmers in particular to the dairy sector.
Exactly. And so let's go into the other slides we have next. We'll kind of quickly go through these next slides because we talked about them overall. So once again, it's kind of rules of origin issues we talked about before. Let's just click through that one and go to the next one. This is a slide I really love.
Yes.
It shows how we have our automotive manufacturing related businesses in Kentucky. And as you can see, there are very few areas across the state that are not touched by some kind of manufacturing auto industry business.
I'm guessing this is Bowling Green right here in the bottom left.
Yes, where we have GM.
The Cadillac
Corvettes. Yes. And so when you look at this, the first thing you see is how important the automotive industry is to Kentucky, both vehicles and parts and components, right? But I also like to highlight, as I did in my first class with you, this is a strength, and I think in the future, it's also going to be a threat to our economy. And Dr. Muhammad, do you want to drill in on why it might be a threat?
Yes, and I'm really glad you brought that up. So you talked about how physical parts, sort of in automobiles, are increasingly being replaced with electronic parts.
Right.
And sort of the longer term implications that might have for demand for shop floor workers in the auto sector.
Exactly.
So you're talking about how you had an opportunity to tour, various car factories around the world. You were talking about how you were touring car factories in China in particular, I believe.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, what happened was at that car plant in China that produces 400,000 electric vehicles a year, I saw less than 25 employees in that plant producing these cars. And let's not forget, when you're talking about electrical vehicles, there are about 30 to 35% less components in an electrical vehicle than there are in a regular car. And so some of the components we're making right now, maybe 15, 20 years from now, will no longer be needed in the cars we're using to get from place to place. And that's going to impact what you see here on this map before us right now.
And it's worth noting that USMCA also includes a wage floor. I believe that 40 to 45% of the value content in automobiles has to come from factories now, or will have to come from factories where employees are making a minimum of at least $16 per hour.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I said I think that workers in Mexico will actually have a great benefit from this new USMCA agreement because their wages will be higher based on that regulation or that rule.
Do you think at the very least over the short term, you'll see a migration of some of the auto jobs in Mexico to the United States and Canada, where kind of those wages are more in line with where auto plants in Detroit, auto plants in Windsor and Bowling Green, what they might already be paying their employees?
Now that I'm not sure of. I have not really done enough to really look at that flow yet. And quite frankly, with what's going on right now in the world, I'm not sure how that's going to impact future growth and or movement of people and goods.
Remind me to bring that up with you before we get off this call.
Okay.
I think that's a very important point to conclude on.
I will. Let's go down. So once again, our next slide is about agriculture. and we touched on this, Canada's milk pricing program. In the future, I promise you, Dr. Mohammed, I will remove unfair. I'll just put Canada's milk pricing program, and also talk about poultry as well. We talked about that earlier.
I appreciate that. So I'm Canadian, for all of you who don't know. Been working on, I say about the American way now. I don't say about anymore. So I'm working on my Americanization. So.
You know, talking to you, I had no idea you're from Canada. So, you know. Yeah,
I have kind of a very neutral, sort of American. I was in North Carolina for 8 years, and this is my first year in Kentucky. So if anything, I think I got a slight Southern drawl now.
And by the way, I like you a lot. I forgive you for your time in North Carolina. I'm glad you finally came.
Right. But at least I'm not a Duke fan.
You're right. That's good. That's good.
Tar Heel. It's the lesser of two evils.
That's good.
Erran is big blue all the way, by the way.
Oh, yes. I grew up in Lexington and have been a UK fan since I can remember. If you pan the house right now, you'd see my UK hat sitting on the counter. I'm big blue all the way.
I think center is right down the middle between big blue and the Cards. I haven't been able to fully capture the mood on campus. It seems like the students are roughly split between the two programs.
That's interesting because I don't know anybody who likes Louisville.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as its name indicates, center is right in the middle of the state. We get a lot of people from Louisville,
right.
A lot of people from Lexington. I would say slightly more from Louisville because people in Lexington tend to go to UK.
Right.
So we've got a very interesting dynamic at center. I'm sure I'll hear about it in my student comments when
Okay, so one of the things I want students to do on this is to tag whether you're a UK or Cardinals fan, so we can get an unofficial poll.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good interactive bit, and I'm going to actually tag this part of the video and sort of get them to interact with it. I think that's a really good idea.
That's awesome.
Yeah, you're sort of hedging your bets here with the blue and red slide. So kind of once a politician, always a politician.
And you can barely see it, but in the background there is the American flag that's in the background on those slides. So.
No, it's beautiful. You're really putting my PowerPoint game to shame here. That was part of the trepidation I had for even doing this. Is your slides are so beautiful and really streamlined.
Well, I appreciate that. It's a kind compliment. Thank you, sir. So, we talked about
continue on with market access.
Yeah, we talked about market access a little bit. So let's get past market access and talk about intellectual property. So this is really important.
Yeah. USMCA was exceptional in a number of different ways for having provisions relating to intellectual property.
Right. And I think it's important because we have to remember, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was first written, I was in college. This is the 1990s.
You're in your senior year of college, chilling with what he did at Howard, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
A tangent we can't quite get into now, but I might release Erran the college years as a follow-up. We're only really scratching the surface here.
That'll be my TV show, Erran the college years.
Yeah.
So. But in terms of intellectual property, we have to realize that, I was actually a junior in college when we first started about NAFTA, And, there was no Facebook. The internet was just now starting to kick off. In fact, I remember we had this thing called the web crawler, the World Wide Web thing, and it was just completely slow. Kids nowadays would never have dealt with what we dealt with back in the early days.
Yeah, like the 14.4 modems. You could only use your phone or your internet on phone lines.
It was horrible. And so we built the North American Free Trade Agreement based on that time period, and things had changed so much. So the USMCA had to catch up with some of the things that we missed during the first NAFTA agreement, just because those realities did not exist. And more, as we talk about how are we going to do things like trade via e-commerce, things of that nature, how are we going to tax those things or work those kinds of operations? Because it's important to have regulations that say, hey, between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, e-commerce is going to be a free trade kind of environment as well.
So. And also kind of getting into the politics of data storage. data localization. A
Exactly.
lot of really sophisticated stuff in this agreement.
Right.
Also worth noting that it's the first trade agreement in history to have provisions written in against currency manipulation,
Exactly. Yes.
which I believe sends a very clear signal to China going forward.
Yeah, and I was going to say, what you see in the USMCA are lessons learned a lot from our relationship between not only China, but also India in terms of data storage and currency manipulation. And so this kind of lays a good framework of kind of how we believe trade should work between countries.
Yeah, these haven't really been issues within the continent. I think within the continent, we've been working with one another in good faith in these areas. But it's language that's quite valuable, and I think language that's going to be emulated in a lot of our future trade agreements. With actors who behave more questionably surrounding areas like cybersecurity, piracy, and haven't quite engaged with the same level of good faith. So I think it's quite proactive and quite forward-looking in that respect.
Exactly. I'd agree 100%.
So I think this is one of the really big takeaways from USMCA.
I
And
agree.
one of the areas where it's really ahead of the curve.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, our next slide is about small business. And I think we've touched on that enough in some of our other slides. But it's important to note that there was a real focus by the administration, the Trump administration, to make sure that small and medium-sized businesses were getting a good share of the trade or easier access to markets under this new agreement. And as you can see from our earlier slides from Kentucky, when you have over 50% of the manufacturers being small and medium-sized businesses to Canada and Mexico, it's important that we support those companies and organizations.
So these are not just the really big players. It's not just Boeing or General Motors or the massive multinational corporations that are benefiting. There's really an emphasis on small and medium businesses and them being able to improve their bottom lines through continentalization of the North American economy.
Yeah. And let's not forget, as great as some of these big corporations are, the true engine of the U.S. economy still is small and medium-sized business organizations.
Certainly, I mean, if you look where most people work.
Right. Exactly. And then let's go back to labor. This goes to the next slide. Goes to something that you mentioned earlier about the minimum wage for manufacturers in the automotive sector, things of that nature. I think, the emphasis on how we have fair labor standards across the three countries is very important. And sends a message about how we want workers to be treated and how we want to balance trade. Because don't forget, one of the arguments before was that because wages were so low in Mexico, they were getting an advantage over U.S. manufacturers. These new labor standards kind of level the playing field on wages, but also on how workers are treated as well, which is equally or more important than the wages.
So are you willing to give the Democrats just a little bit of credit for some of these provisions? So you had a kind of a first round of USMCA that was agreed upon right after the Democrats took control of the House, I think late November of 2018. You had a protocol that was created in consultation with Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats about a year later. And that's where you had a number of these labor standards included in USMCA. So I know you're a good Republican yourself, but you want to give the Democrats just a bit of, in the spirit of bipartisanship, just a bit of the credit here?
No, in the spirit of bipartisanship, I give them a great deal of credit for the changes they made to make this better, especially when it comes in terms of labor standards. Me personally, whether you're Republican or a Democrat, the need to have good working standards for our people is it's important, ultimately important across the board. And as we can start to make more agreements that have these labor standards kind of in there, I think we make the economy of the world and for the workers much better overall. So, yes, I give the Democrats all the credit for inserting these labor standards into the agreement. I think it's important. It's something we need to do on all of our agreements as we move forward to talk about how we make fair labor standards across the globe for all of our people.
Yeah, USMCA is, above all, I think it's a great case study in how even in our polarized environment and political landscape, bipartisanship can work. it can and does work. I think this is one of the more, in my view, astounding bipartisan efforts I've seen in the past 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And as you mentioned before, we talked about how easily it passed. I think because we had this kind of leveling out of the Republicans getting what they want, Democrats getting what they want, makes it a lot easier to take on both sides and get this moved through the policy process. And so, yeah, definitely.
So one of the criticisms that I've seen out there among Democrats is that there's no mention of climate change in USMCA.
Yeah. And as you know, that's a political landmine between Republicans and Democrats. It's kind of always been there. But once again, I'm also a Republican who supports, tough environmental laws and regulations, because I do believe we have to take care of our environment and our climate for future generations. I do believe in climate change and the need for us to protect our environment. Oddly enough, when I was a student at Howard University, I actually lobbied for Greenpeace and the U.S. PROGRE, which is about clean water, clean air regulations in the U.S. So that's something that's dear to me as well.
Any more on labor standards you want to go over?
No. And digital trade is the next one. And I think that we talked about that a little bit as well. But, this is the first time under the USMCA that we really dove into the whole digital trade arena or sector. And that's because, as we said before, so much has changed between the 1990s NAFTA and the 2018-2019 USMCA. And so this really kind of protects those new industries that are coming on board and looks into e-commerce as well.
So it's very much kind of looking at the economy of 2020 and beyond.
Yes.
I've been very impressed by how forward-looking of an agreement USMCA is.
And let me just say this from a personal level. So as you know, as a student, I was able to work on the first kind of North American Free Trade Agreement outlines in the beginning. Although George H. Bush started the discussions, it was actually Bill Clinton under his administration that got the NAFTA agreement actually signed and moving forward. Most recently, when they started this kind of USMCA discussions, oddly enough, I had just moved back to Washington, D.C. to work for the U.S. Department of Commerce for the administration as a foreign direct investment trade advisor.
This is the Clinton administration.
What are you saying?
Clinton administration.
So I worked in the Clinton administration, and then in 2017, I was back in Washington, D.C., working with the Trump administration as a foreign direct investment advisor at the Department of Commerce when USMCA became something we were working on at the time. And I got to see the men and women who were the policy wonks working on this agreement. And the amount of time, effort, and thoughtfulness they put into trying to come up with a great agreement was absolutely incredible. Like I said, I was on the same floor with these guys at the Department of Commerce.
So you cut out on me a little bit. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Hello? Erran, you cut out on me a bit?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, I hear you again.
Okay, good. Not sure what happened. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
I was just saying that overall, it was incredible to see the amount of work that this team put into trying to come up with a great agreement that would be far-reaching and, as you say, reach into the 2020 and beyond economy.
And they got it done really fast, too.
Yeah, but I saw them work some crazy hours trying to get this thing done. Yeah. And so let's go to our next slide. Just this kind of getting toward the end here. Once again, just shows you the impact of what's going on. So 90% bigger. Kentucky's motor vehicle exports to Canada and Mexico have increased by 90% over the past decade, over the past 10 years. That's incredible.
And you've had some really competent, sort of in both parties, you've had some really competent state governance. I've heard a lot about Martha Lane Collins and a lot of the work she did, sort of bringing in like Toyota, Nissan, the Japanese manufacturers to Kentucky. You've had kind of from both sides of Both parties, very forward-looking state governments here in Kentucky, are really trying to utilize a number of Kentucky's comparative advantages.
Exactly. And yes, first of all credit to Martha Lane Collins, Governor Martha Lane Collins, who really created in Kentucky this new dynamic of how to look at foreign investors. Now, Toyota was not the first Japanese company in Kentucky, but it was the biggest. And at that time, Martha Lane Collins, Governor Collins, went through a lot to make that deal happen because people did not see her vision. Now today, when they have almost 10,000 employees at the Toyota plant in Kentucky and lots of other businesses connected to that company, to Toyota, you see the impact they have had on our economy and how forward-thinking that Governor Martha Lane Collins was at that time. Absolutely incredible to think about what she did in her time. And then what you've seen over the years is how foreign direct investment in our state has just grown and grown and grown. Companies from all over the world, over 500, that are invested in Kentucky, making their products here and shipping them around the world. It's incredible.
So, I mean, not only do we have the right location, but we've had good leadership who have been able to recognize a number of opportunities in the international trade arena for Kentucky.
Exactly. And also, of course, I have to give kudos to the governor I work for, Governor Matt Bevin, as well. As you know, under his 4 years, there was more investment in Kentucky than any other 4-year administration. And that's because the focus was about how do we help businesses grow in Kentucky and attract more businesses into the state. Now, once again, for the record, the growth in investment in Kentucky, almost 60% of that investment came from companies that were already here and expanded, as opposed to new companies coming in. So a lot of that growth was growth from companies that were already within our state.
So I'm kind of in the limited time we have left. One thing we haven't touched on yet was one of the more controversial provisions of USMCA. That's, of course, the 16-year sunset clause. Are there concerns on your end or on the end of the pro-trade contingent that this sunset clause might reduce the level of uncertainty for internationally focused businesses?
You know, I can't really speak directly to that. I'm not sure how that's going to work out in the end, because I don't think that we have seen the last of this USMCA agreement. I think before we get to any kind of those sunset clauses, we're going to see more changes to this agreement overall, maybe in this administration or next administration that comes on board. So I can't really speak to that at this point. I don't know is the answer.
So where would you anticipate that those changes come from? Sort of in what areas do you think there's still work to be done, or you might see more deliberation under the USMCA framework?
Going back to the discussion that you had earlier about the environment, I think that if we have a shift in political party and power over the next 4 years or the next election even, I think you may see during that term some move to talk about environmental standards, some moves to talk about how we can better support workers throughout this agreement. So I think if the administration changes the next cycle, even that early, you could see some possible changes or amendments to the USMCA.
So I believe last I saw, the United States Trade Representative was eyeing a June 2020 start date.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that's going to be doable with the current climate?
And see, that's not something I would predict. With so much going on right now, you know, it'd be hard for me to say what's going to happen. Everything has just shifted, and priorities and energies have changed. So I don't know if that's going to be possible or not. And not being in Washington, D.C. right now, I'm not sure how many people are really still pushing to move this forward, or how hard they're pushing to move things forward.
Because I believe you were waiting on Canada to pass legislation. We did right before Canada took a hiatus in their own parliament for to respond to COVID-19. So I think this the bill in Canada was passed on March the 13th. Parliament was suspended the next day. Not sure what the state of affairs is in the United States Congress, but that's going to be an interesting storyline to follow as to whether or not a June 2020 start date is feasible.
Right. I agree 100%. And, you know, that's another topic we're going to talk about as well, right? Was what do we think this virus is going to have on the actual trade overall, right?
I think we can get into that now, because I believe this is your final slide.
Well, yes, I think there's one more after that, but that's just about aerospace exports, which are 2 times bigger.
So
yeah, that's it. But that's.
Did you want to get into a bit of a sort of discussion on your end from the implications of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and how this might affect continental trade going forward?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. So let's just, of course, at this point, I'm not smart enough to know exactly what the impacts are going to be. And the closest thing I have to compare this to would be what happened in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, right? So I'll speak from that.
Yeah, 2009 was my senior year of college. I remember looking for a job in that landscape quite well.
And how did that work out for you? Was it tough during that time?
I got into grad school.
Smart.
Yeah, it was my plan, kind of avoid reality for as long as possible.
So let's talk about that time period then. So 2008, 2009, we actually saw trade volumes plunge sharply. Consumer demand, business activity really dried up during that period of time, as what's happening right now with the coronavirus as well. So during that period of time, in terms of U.S.-Mexico trade, and once again, this in terms of the 2008, 2009 crisis, the trade between exports between the U.S. and Canada fell by 21%.
Over that calendar year or over that fiscal year?
Through that fiscal year of 8 to 9. And then the imports from Canada fell by 30% during that period of time. Mexico fared a little bit better. U.S. exports to Mexico fell by 15% during that period, and imports from Mexico fell by 18%. In my thinking and in my mindset, that's the bottom. That's the minimum impact you're going to see from this coronavirus. I think it'll be greater on both sides, the impact it'll have to our trade moving forward. Even though the borders for goods and our supply chain are so open between the U.S. and Canada, the demand may not be there. The business activity is not there as well. And so it's going to be interesting to see what kind of dips we have as a result of the coronavirus in terms of U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada trade. And I'd be really interested to hear also, Dr. Mohammed, your ideas, your thoughts about that as well.
Well, I think they're going to be somewhat limited given the fact that, thank goodness, we got USMCA dealt with when we did. Thank goodness we put at least some level, we restored at least some level of confidence for investors that this has happened after, literally just after we got USMCA in place. And at least there's going to be some certainty going forward. So, I mean, those, I think you're right. I think we can look at, this is obviously a very, very difficult thing to discuss, but we can look at 08, 09 as a best case scenario, which is a very difficult thing to say.
Right.
Thank goodness we have some type of certainty in place with an agreement, with what I think is a strong agreement. That's been celebrated on all sides and is generally been viewed as a good one by experts and analysts in the business community. So I think having this certainty in place for the next 16 years at least through USMCA might be a silver lining. And at the very least, we're not having to deal with more uncertainty in terms of the politics of continental trade.
Right. And then just not knowing how long this is going to last, right? I'm seeing literally over the past week, the mark has moved a few times. So it was Easter, then it was end of April. I'm now in Ohio listening to the governor here, DeWine, who has moved their lockdown into May the 1st. And so just how long we take this out is going to mean a lot to how we recover.
All right. Well, you and I should head to the Derby together in September. That should be our goal.
Okay.
Get our mint
you said that. I am committed.
If that's what you're into, that could be the. You
are not committed. So the Derby in September, you have to be there with me at the Derby in September.
Yeah.
I'm down to be with me in Louisville or at Cleveland for the Derby.
Yeah, so that could be something that helps us get through it together.
There you
That
go.
can be our tentative. So yeah, I feel like I got to take responsibility for the Derby's been the first week in May, sort of every year since World War II. I live in Kentucky 1 year and it gets delayed. So I think that's on me.
I'm putting it on you. Yeah,
I have to take responsibility for that.
And by the way, my birthday is May the 6th. And so usually the Derby falls within my birthday week. And it's always something I love to do is celebrate my birthday and the Derby together, having grown up in the horse industry. So thank you, Dr. Muhammad, for messing up my first birthday.
Oh, that's a really good time to have a birthday living in Kentucky. I couldn't think of a better birthday to have. Because my birthday is actually it's on the 8th of July.
Okay.
So every year I get Canada Day, which is on the 1st of July. I obviously get Independence Day, and then I get my birthday. So it's like an entire week. An entire week, that's Raheem Week. That's
great.
So I really appreciate your time. This is a lot of fun on my end. I think I really needed this. I needed this human interaction. Like I said, I hope you've been keeping well. I know you usually love to take a selfie after these things. I don't think we're going to be able to do that, but I will take a screenshot. And I'll
that sounds good.
So
I appreciate that. And like I got to tell you, thank you so much for allowing me to do this. I really do enjoy doing this. Of course, I love it more when I'm actually with the students in front of them, feeling their energy and talking to them directly and filling their questions.
I mean this 100% as a compliment, but I've never met someone who geeks out on trade policy to the extent that you do. You take it to another level.
Well, thank you. Thank you, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean that 100% as a compliment.
Well, thank you.
Well, this is really great.
I appreciate it. Thank you, sir, so much.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.